welcome to our second in our series of interviews where we are trying to share the experience of people who have done relevant things in the GRC space, governance, risk, and compliance. Our first interview person was Mariano Gochman, who's the regional compliance officer for Siemens based in Chile. And we had pretty good feedback about that interview. And today we'll be interviewing Joaquin Vial, who's the legal affairs manager in Australis. And we have David Cannon as our guest interviewer. I'll be introducing both of them shortly, but welcome and thank you for taking the time. And today we'll be speaking about enterprise service management, which that is basically the concept of service management that is part of ITIL, that is a framework in the IT space, applied to other areas of the business, in this case, the legal industry, sorry, the legal area. So for this presentation, because it's something fairly different, we have a format change from our regular interview in our first interview. And that is that in the first half of the interview, David and I will introduce the concepts. And in the second half, David will be interviewing Joaquin. They have not met before this interview. I've been working with Joaquin in the implementation that he will be sharing his experience for the last year. And I've also been talking about this with David, who's been kindly mentoring me and giving me feedback and help me articulate what we've been doing. And so the agenda for today is first, David will be introducing ITIL and enterprise service management. David is an expert and thought leader in ITIL, and he has his own consulting company. He has had several leadership roles in Forrester Research, BMC Software, and Hewlett Packard. He was chairman for 2 years of the International Executive Board of the Service Management Forum. And he's the lead editor of the books on ITIL 4 digital and IT strategy and acquiring and managing cloud services. And so let's just say he knows what he's speaking about. And Australis, which is the experience that we'll be sharing, is the second salmon producer in Chile. And Chile is the second salmon producer in the world behind Norway. And salmon is a very important industry, and here in Chile is the second largest behind copper, and in terms of exports. And Joaquin is a lawyer. He's a legal affairs manager in Australis. His responsibilities also include compliance. And the legal area in Australis also manages regulatory compliance. So it's an area that's very close to the business. And as I mentioned, we've been working with them for a little bit over a year, and we've implemented 4 services covering 7 areas. And Joaquin is responsible for 3 of those services, and he'll be sharing his experience in the second half of this interview. So without further ado, thank you for your participation, and let's start with David telling us about what ITIL is.
Thanks, Gerardo. So ITIL is a set of books primarily that provide guidance about how we manage technology. And initially, in the late 1980s, it was really meant to ask the question, how does IT manage IT operations? We understand we have great applications, and the functionality that those applications provide is really good, but very often those applications would fail in operations. So how do we make sure that operations in IT is stable? And that was the initial question that we asked. But of course, the use of IT has been evolving and changing very quickly over the last 20 or 30 years. And ITIL has been keeping track of that. ITIL is a best practice. In other words, it takes a look at what's going on in the industry, and whatever is working well, it documents. So it's each of these versions of ITIL is a snapshot of where the industry is at a particular point. And I'm not going to go through into each one, but it's very interesting to note that the industry in IT has changed from how do we manage IT in operations to where we are today, which is how do organizations build value using digital technology? So it's no longer about the technology as a primary concern. It's about business success. And it's focusing on how we use technology to increase our competitiveness, our effectiveness, our efficiency as an organization. So that's what ITIL does. It blends the world of technology and the world of business, and it asks how we can be successful in that world. Now, if we go onto the next slide, we'll take a look at what service management is about. And there's a lot of misunderstanding about service management. For a lot of people, service management is just about creating a service desk which can handle things when, IT problems when something breaks. But actually, service management is something a lot broader, a lot bigger than that. So in the 1960s, there were a lot of academic and formal approaches to how IT should be managed. And those approaches came from two areas. One was manufacturing, where people would look at IT and say, this is very similar to an assembly line, where you have data moving through or workloads moving through devices. And they start at one end and they come out the other end with some sort of output. And I think there's certainly some components in IT that are like an assembly line, but actually the second approach that was proposed was a more relevant approach, and that is the service-based approach. And looking at that, when the original authors of ITIL were writing about how do we manage technology, they took a lot of guidance from service organizations, healthcare, hospitality, restaurants, that kind of thing, because managing technology is very much like managing the demand in any of those kind of areas. We have specialist resources, we have users coming in, and we don't know what workloads those users are going to demand at any particular time. So the workloads are dynamic. And the way in which we fulfill or respond to those workloads is dynamic as well. And so it's not a fixed set of activities through an assembly line. It's very often a dynamic network of activities that are happening around the organization. So the service-based approach became the predominant approach in how we manage IT. There are still some manufacturing components in there, of course. And for those, we have approaches that are very relevant to managing those approaches like lean and so on. But by and large, the approach we take to managing IT is a service-based approach. So if we look at a lot of the practices that were used in managing IT, a lot of those came from service industries. But what's really interesting is as we applied those practices from the service industries into managing IT, we actually expanded our understanding of how those processes work. So we learned from these service organizations, we applied that into a world of technology. We learned from that and we started seeing new possibilities on how the way in which technology is managed can create even more opportunities for the business part of the organization. So we see organizations continuing to evolve by understanding both the services they provide as well as the way in which they use technology. And these two elements keep feeding each other and growing each other. And this is exactly what we're starting to see happening in this term of so-called enterprise service management, which is on the next slide. And enterprise service management is really where we take what we've learned about how we manage technology and we start applying it across the organization as a whole. And again, we're not taking an individual element of IT like a service desk and putting it into the business and saying, well, now we have enterprise service management. No, you don't. You have an HR service desk or a legal affairs service desk. Enterprise service management is when you make a formal decision that we as an organization are going to use a service-based governance model to direct the way we do business. And a lot of the lessons that we learned from IT and digital technology, we're going to use those lessons and those tools in how we manage the services in our organization. So if we were to have a working definition, it's not a formal definition, but a working definition of ESM, enterprise service management, is using a service-based approach to ensure that multiple parts of an organization collaborate so that together they meet the overall business objectives, and they do it in a way that is effective and efficient. And business objectives can range anywhere from, we need to have a better operations, to we need to be more competitive, or we need to open a new market, or we need to get more loyalty from our customers in our existing markets. All of these objectives are potentially the kind of objectives that we would use service management to meet. Now, there are some problems with enterprise service management. If we look at the next slide, here are some of them. The first one is getting the right owners. And in some organizations, we have somebody saying, well, you IT people, you did service management, so we're going to take the IT people and we're going to put them in charge of a business unit. Well, that doesn't really work. They're not responsible for the business unit. So they may know something about IT service management, but they don't have responsibility to make decisions for a business unit. So the right person to own service management is the person who is responsible for the business. The second problem is getting the scope right. And again, I mentioned this, a lot of people look at ESM and they say, oh, well, all we have to do is take service desk, incident management, and problem management and get it working somewhere else in the organization. Well, what you have there is just two instances of service management. One is IT service management. The other one is financial service management, or whatever it is, or sales service management. I don't know what they're using it for, but it is not enterprise. It doesn't cover the whole enterprise. ESM is where it enables different groups to collaborate with each other. It doesn't just set up and reinforce existing silos. Another thing is that your culture changes, and this is something a lot of organizations are unprepared for. When you have to collaborate with other parts of the business, it changes the culture, the way in which people communicate with each other. And so you've got to be prepared for that, and you've got to support it, and you've got to encourage it. You can't just implement a new process that automates ineffective behavior or existing behavior. You're changing behavior. The fourth issue is with objectives and metrics. Some organizations will try to implement ESM, but they keep the old metrics, which are based on individual team performance, not on cross-team performance. Now, if you want to implement ESM, you have to start changing the metrics to measure how the organization works together through the process, not retain the old metrics. And then finally is that there is often a misunderstanding that there is an ESM tool and the tool will tell us how this has got to work. It doesn't. There are tools you can use to support ESM, but you first have to get the people working together. You first have to get the organization focused on its outcomes that it wants to achieve. Then you can go back and you can get the tool working to support it. And to be perfectly honest, there is no out-of-the-box tool for any industry which tells you how an enterprise should manage itself as a service organization across every part of that organization. There are tools that provide workflows, capabilities that provide, process support capabilities, but they don't tell you how you should do ESM within a particular type of organization at this stage. The tools that we have are still very generic and they have to be applied. So very important, people first, organization first, and tools come later. So that in a nutshell is an overview of what I think the major challenges of ESM are.
Thank you, David. So how does this apply to legal services? And basically, I ended up applying the ITIL concept of service to other areas before knowing that I learned through David that it was called enterprise service management. And my view was that in different assessments that we were doing for IT using ITIL, we ended up talking with business areas, and I realized that basically the issues extended to business area and mapped pretty clearly to the issues that were addressed by ITIL in IT. So in this diagram, I want to sort of graphically show that what I saw was different areas in the company have different responsibilities, obviously, but they have a different worldview. It's much deeper than responsibilities. And basically, they have their own metrics, their own incentives. They have their own way of looking at the world. And if they have also different professions, they were raised differently and look at the world in a different way. So what happens at the end is that IT, where ITIL started, naturally tries to interact with other areas, trying to make them look at the world in the IT way. So they will talk about applications and database and security and networks and so on that don't make any sense to the business. And it's not obvious probably, but my experience is that when you interact with other areas, it's the same phenomenon. You might look at compliance, training people on some law or regulation that they need to comply with, instead of talking about how that impacts their business. So they're doing the same way, taking the technical view and making others come into that technical view. The same might be with operations that are talking about their maintenance schedules and so on without explaining what that means for the other areas. And the same happens with the rest of the world. And how this is normally addressed, I think one of the clearest examples is when companies implement SAP, the enterprise resource planning software. And what they do is basically finance takes their view of the world and makes everybody comply with it. So they will say, these are the cost centers, this is the purchase order process, and so on. And that works, and it works wonderfully. The issue is that it's very resource intensive, and it also has a big impact on the organization and is very complex to implement. And it doesn't scale. So it's not reasonable for IT to do the same thing, to implement something so that everybody else looks at the things the same way that they do. And the same is for compliance or legal. So our view is that we have the analogy of, if you're building a house, you want to look at the house plan. And if you interact with the electrician, for example, you want to talk first with the electrician and for him to discuss with you where the electrical outlets will be, where the switches will be, where the lights will be. But you don't want to look at the electrical diagram for the house. First you want to look at the functional part of what's relevant for you. You might want to look at it later, but it's not the main discussion that you want to have. And basically this is what's happening in the last diagram, where each area is coming with their electrical diagram, if you will, to speak with everybody else, and everybody else doesn't understand things the way that they want them to. So the first thing that we see in service implementation is that it helps provide a common language for everybody to have a simplified view and be more effective in reaching company goals. So basically, our version of the plan of the house, plan, is that everybody should be speaking in terms of the business. And by that, we mean business processes. So the version of you have to come and show me here in this house plan is that if for compliance, for example, if you want to talk to me, you need to show me what you're going to do, what you want to accomplish, in terms of the business processes. For example, don't tell me that you will implement a program to comply with this regulation or law. Tell me what the plant manager needs to know about all his compliance responsibilities, because we don't really care if his responsibilities come from this law or this regulation. We just want to know what he needs to do so that we cover our legal risk. The same applies for legal. We don't need to know the details of the type of contract or other legal exposure. Just tell us what we need to do and how this impacts our business processes and what are the metrics that we need to have. So in this sense, talking with David, I found somebody called Clayton Christensen. He's the author of the book Innovator's Dilemma. And I found that he also shows the relevance of having a common language for different areas of the company to be effective. But he also talks about jobs. And the concept is basically that for products and services, besides the functionality, you hire those products or services to do a job. And in that sense, I found that it clarified for me that the job of doing or implementing service management, the job of the service is solving this issue of solving the complexity in the interaction between the different areas. So basically, the way for different areas to come to the business and communicate is through the service. So the idea is that for us, the job of the service is to hide this complexity and to align everybody in terms of seeing a common house plan, which is the common language that we're talking about. So that for us clarified the approach that we wanted to take in the implementation with Australis. And this is a diagram of one of the services that we implemented, which is the contract management service. And for the legal areas, it's I think, and Joaquin can comment later, it's a pretty important difference in looking at the world, because the standard approach is the legal area will receive a request from the business that they need to contract some services or buy some products, and they will help them elaborate, create a contract. After that, legal's responsibilities are sort of over, and the contract is managed by the business and maybe logistics or the purchasing department or somebody else. And in this view, legal actually manages a service, which is the contract management service, because we understand that the idea of having a contract is to mitigate legal risk and protect the company and make sure that they're getting what they bought. So basically, we took the document contract and we took apart the obligations that are in that contract, and we identified them and we prioritized them, and we took the most important ones, and we agreed with our internal customer, in this case logistics, that these are the obligations that we want to manage with you to make sure that the business meets their goals, and also that we mitigate legal risk. So basically, we have a relationship where legal is providing a service and logistics is the customer. And there was an agreement on a monthly report where we would have KPIs and evidence that these legal obligations were being managed correctly. And the responsibility of the manager of this service is not to provide the report or anything, but to provide an analysis of what's happening and what needs to be done. So basically, the data and the report are a tool for the service owner to do an analysis and to make sure that the service is doing its job. In this case, mitigating legal risk and supporting the business in being covered and getting services that they need in a timely manner. So in our experience implementing this, for me, having tried to do service management in most cases unsuccessfully in companies, the first conclusion that I arrived at was that we lacked executive support, if you will, or tone at the top, or whatever you want to call it. But at the end of the day, I found that what we were doing didn't really resonate with them. So basically, instead of telling them that we need to implement these processes and this report and these tools, and I need you to do this and he will do that, and have these roles and this complex procedures, what we did in Australis was basically identify a service owner, and we basically defined that he or she, in this case, is responsible for the job. And the service owner is responsible for this service, in this case, contract management, to mitigate legal risk and support the business in a timely fashion. How they will do it, no idea, whatever they need to do, and we will support them in that road, if you will. So basically, instead of sitting down to design processes and reports and implement tools, we sat down with the service owner to help them design this, identify the priorities, identify the obligations in this case, speak with the internal customer, understand what their priorities were, how they were measured, what their incentives were, agree on what was important, and help them cycle through elaborating the necessary reports and KPIs and so on. And after several cycles, the experience has been more successful in a way that we feel that it's sticky in the sense that people understand what they're doing, and it's something that already has some traction. So basically, for us, one of the key things was an iterative approach. We implemented the first service in 3 months. So basically, after the initial assessment, we went straight ahead and implemented the service, and we designed it while we were implementing it. And that was very important because you don't understand something as complex as a service in a company such as Australis until you implement it. So there's no sense in designing something without the necessary understanding. And we built the understanding while we were doing the design. And the idea is to involve the customer as somebody who's involved in this process, in a view where there's co-creation of value, and it's not something that I do something, I report to you, you do something, you report to me. We are together and trying to understand how we can do this better and have improvement. So for us, the important part is that the service becomes sort of the North Star to make sure that everybody's focused on the business when we're not getting lost in processes or tools or things that we're doing day to day, and that we address the elephant in the room. One of the important things for us is for the service owner to bring to the table basically things that are not working, that involve several areas that are not easily addressed. And focusing on those big issues has been important in us getting traction and support and credibility in the implementation in Australis. So having said this, let's go forward with the interview so that David can talk to Joaquin about what his experience has been with this strange concept and these weird ideas.
Horrifying experience. No.
First of all, Joaquin, very good to meet you. And I've heard just so many good things about what you've achieved. And I would like to say that based on what I've heard, what you've achieved in Australis is probably one of the best examples of enterprise service management that I have seen over the last 5 years. And so I really want to understand a lot more about what you're doing and what your experience was, and some of the lessons that you've learned, as well as some of the successes that you've achieved. So, but let's start out, if I can ask you where you started. What was your initial experience before you started doing ESM, one, and two, why did you start doing ESM?
Yeah, first of all, thanks, Gerardo, for the invitation. And very nice to meet you, David. Our first experience was since the beginning we were very skeptical on this whole idea and mechanic of working, of doing legal work within a company. In part because of our formation as lawyers, and also because the language used by inside in the project was very different from the language we are used to. Concepts as complexity, theories, outcomes, services, accountability, etc., we weren't very used to. And well, the latter forced us to break our comfort zone and to start trying to understand what this was all about. And that required a bit of faith in Gerardo and Marco, which we had luckily. And then we once the project was on its way, it was also very difficult to see the actual results that we were getting. We wanted to see the completion of the stages, and we worked in a way, in a mindset that needed like a timetable project, and that wasn't going to happen because we were starting to like breaking the walls and getting into a new way of working. So at first very skeptical, and then we little by little we started to understand what this was all about. You are muted.
Thank
There
you.
you go.
What was the problem or the challenge that you were trying to solve?
Well, we were trying to get a little bit of more exposure within the company. We felt like our work was just to revise documentation, to revise draft of contracts, and our job would end there. So we weren't really providing a complete legal service in terms of trying to reduce the legal exposure, because we would just go through the papers and then forget about the deal. And that was a problem because we weren't actually getting what we wanted to, which is to be on top of what's going on in the business.
So were you finding that once the paperwork had been signed, that what was actually happening in the business was different? It was changing from what it was supposed to have
Yes,
been doing?
correct.
Okay, right.
Yes, correct. That it didn't happen. It doesn't happen. Sorry, all the time. But we found out that sometimes what was regulated and what was agreed wasn't really getting. It wasn't the same as in the real life. There was no conversation between the paper and the reality within the company.
Right.
And that was mainly because we weren't on top of the business.
Right. And so everybody was doing their job, and they were doing their job very well, but the results were not what was desired. Or they
Correct.
weren't what you'd hoped for. So,
Correct.
um, so your goal in doing this was really to make sure that the reality of the situation matched with the compliance and the regulatory requirements and the contracts that were signed as part of that. All of those had to be brought together. What
Right.
was preventing you from doing that in the past?
Well, a way of working based on the development of a written documentation, procedures, internal policies that are very structured and do not require to go out and follow up on what the documentation tries to regulate. Um, and we thought that we genuinely thought that by working that way we could reach changes and ongoing improvements, but the reality proved otherwise.
Right.
And also what prevented us was the understanding of the work of a legal team as a reviser of documentation and ending there.
Right. Whereas the real job that was required was bigger than that. It wasn't just those pieces. It needed to be joined together. So
I don't know. Sorry to interrupt
sure.
you, David. I don't know if Australis represents the whole reality of the whole number of Chilean companies, but I can be very certain that most of the legal departments in Chile work that way. There are some exceptions in like big construction projects where you have someone who is in charge of managing a specific project and has to follow up on the obligations of certain contract like the EPC or whatever. But in the real day-to-day legal job within a company, they probably follow the same path as we used to.
I can certainly respond with some of the experience that I've had in working in ESM projects is that it is very similar in most of the organizations I've worked in. You know, we view the legal department, they're a group of lawyers. They have a very particular role to play at a very particular time, but we have a different role to play in other parts of the business. Once the lawyers have finished, we get on with our job. And there's not that understanding that actually what the lawyers do reaches into our work, and what we do impacts the way the lawyers work. And you know, it's almost like and it's not just about the legal departments. It's HR, it's finance as well. It's almost like you have a role to play. Then when that role is finished, you're finished. Then you can go and do something else. And I think that's a very, I think that is a very common way of working.
That's good to know.
Yeah. So, and that is why, and you know, that is why you're using ESM, and it's why a lot of organizations are asking, is ESM the right approach for us to use? And I think it definitely, in fact, what I want to ask next is what your experience was. So where did you start with your ESM project?
Well, when did we start? Did you say?
No,
Sorry.
no. What did you start with? What was your first set of steps?
Yeah, right. The first service we approached was we started working with the logistic team regarding the transportation of fish in water mainly. At the beginning, we started mapping the different matters within the contracts that we thought would be relevant to consider from a legal slash contractual standpoint. And we began having these conversations with the key executives, who actually didn't really understand either what this was going to be about, but they were very receptive at first. So we started putting everything together and trying to find out which ones were the important metrics. And we got finally into the mechanics of the service. And after analyzing the reports, we found out what the importance of the exercises were given the results. Because we could see many things that we weren't seeing just by drafting the contract. So, for example, we found out that many transportation services had no insurance policies, where by internal policy they are obliged to revise and see what the policies of the third party were. We also found out that some penalties regulated within the contracts weren't being enforced, and some commercial relations didn't even have a written agreements when they had to have them by internal policies and etc. A long list of findings.
So it's interesting how you put that. When I asked you what the first service was, I would expect you to come back and say, our first service was contract management. But what you actually said was, our first service was transportation of fish. And I find that very interesting because it's, you know, the first thing you expect is that legal is responsible for contracts, not transportation of fish. Yet here you're saying we were looking at the service of transportation of fish. And the other interesting thing I find is that the pain points that were being experienced in that service were as a result of the contract being good, but the compliance to that contract not being good. So, so how did you convince the other business leaders that you needed to be involved in transportation of fish and not just drafting contracts?
Well, I'm actually trying to do that as we speak. But I don't know. I think there is a mixture here because they have confidence in the legal team. We have good relations. We have a young team with a lot of energy, and the key managers in Australis are also very open to different ways of working. We are a very young company. I think that helps out. And but also because they weren't caring, they weren't seeing the real risk involved in these things. And today we, as you may know, we are changing our public administration, and the environmental factors are very relevant today. So I think they feel more exposed to risk, and that's also an important thing that they consider to go with the project, and to, because finally they are being more protected if we are checking out on the obligations constantly. So I think
Right.
it's a mixture.
Good. So what I understand is it's reduction in risk. It is making sure that penalties are collected where right, or avoiding penalties in some cases. And your understanding and involvement in this business activity is helping the organization as a whole
Absolutely.
to manage the risk better and to even increase their performance.
Correct.
So so how quickly did you achieve the first results from your initial project?
I think it was quicker than I thought it would be. Um, I think within about 2 to 3 months, we were over the service, and we started to have meetings periodically, and getting the results and getting the data, starting to analyze the data, etc. This was still like a exercise, not formally, but I think by 3 months we were pretty on top of that service specifically.
And what were the primary results that you achieved in those 3 months?
Well, that they got worried, that they finally understood that the contracts are for something, and it's not just for being a pain in the neck for them. They understood that. Well, experience in other parts of the business also show them that if you are not protected by a strong document, then you have less chances to win any case whatsoever. So they started to understand that this was important because it reduces their exposure.
And were they a lot more willing to work with you and answer your questions and give you things that have been difficult to get in the past?
I think yes. I think
Okay.
yes.
So yeah, this is something, this is not a question, but an observation. Something that I notice very often is when people in an organization start to understand how other parts of the organization um, work, just by having those discussions and seeing what they do, it actually makes them a lot more willing to collaborate with each other. And
Absolutely. Well,
yeah,
this way of working, this service-based approach, requires us as lawyers to get out of our books and to start having conversations, which is very typical. We as lawyers, it's a bad for professional formation, but we are very used to just getting to the books, prepare very sophisticated emails which no one reads, but we have to make a special effort to get out of our office and then start having this conversation. So there is a very a change in the execution approach of our job that we had to make.
right.
We need to develop metrics. We need to analyze what the data is telling us. We need to propose working plans, go for accountability, etc. All activities that we weren't used to.
Yes, and I can say exactly the same thing about the IT industry, where we don't stick to books. We stick in we stick in the technology. We love our technology. We love to solve problems, and we're not used to having the kind of discussions that you're having. But what I found is that when you do start to have those discussions, your job in managing technology becomes so much easier because you understand why you're doing certain things. And I think
Absolutely.
that's what you're experiencing as well.
Correct.
So I said earlier, it's about people first and tools second, and I think this is exactly why. So I'm really pleased. Yeah, thank you. That's a great observation. Really pleased to hear that it really it matches my own experience in working in these projects. So once the first service was on its way, what happened next? So you got one service that was successful. People started communicating better. You started getting into the business environment, having ththese discussions. What happened after that?
What were the effects?
Mm,
Um, Well, as I said before, I think the main effect is that we started to be more considered in the business specifically. And that also allowed us to be involved in the conversations with the business and also to find out other things that were happening that would involve risks from different points of view, like let's say antitrust, let's say criminal liabilities of the company, certain environmental risks that we weren't seeing because we weren't having the right conversations. So I think we not by will we found out other things, and that was because of this change of way of working, of change the revision documentation, etc., to a service-based approach.
So just one thing I found very interesting as you were talking is you talked about the business, and that's something we in IT do as well. We talk about the business, and what's interesting to me is that you as a lawyer, for me as an IT person, I would consider you as being the business, but you're as a lawyer looking at other parts of the business and saying that's the business, and I find that very interesting that all of us are defining services that support other parts of the business, and we view those parts of the business as being important. But our role as a business leader is also becoming very important.
Right.
We're starting to play more of a role as a business leader when you start getting involved in some of those discussions. And I found that I find that use of the word the business very interesting, because we do the same thing in IT, and it's almost like we think we're separate from the business because they're over there and we're over here. But what you're doing is you're actually showing your role as a business leader, and I think it's very encouraging, because I think we as IT people need to do that more. And I think people in your situation, whether they're lawyers, whether they're HR professionals, financial professionals, I think very often we see the other part of the organization as the business, but having these discussions helps us to become part of the business. I found that very interesting.
Right.
So you've been doing this now for, I believe, about a year.
Correct.
What what is your experience now? How is it different from when you started?
Right. Well, I think after a year of working on this, we finally understood by force that 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 solutions many times and ongoing improvements within a company uh, will not come out from the fact of a written sheet and a written policy. Gerardo here can testify that he insisted on that point, and I'm a hardhead, couldn't understand that, but I finally got it. Um, and that there are an important number of issues that need to be understood before implementing the procedures. Okay, so understanding it needs to come before designing and planning. That's like the first important conclusion that I could achieve after 1 year. Um, and doing this service-based approach allowed us to be on top of what is going on within the company and prevent that. And it allowed us to be more efficient in the prevention of the different risks. I think we still have a long way to go. This just started here in Australis, but if we can make a comparison with the other way of working, as I said before, this way of working it forced us to go out of our little offices and books, and to mix with the other areas of the company and be more efficient in what we are commanded to do within a company. And finally, I would like the final conclusion is that this way of working can be replied in the other areas also. It's not just like the legal area that has to implement it, but we also in the compliance team can reply the same way of working, and so on and so forth with the different parts of the company.
Right, as those parts of the company really understand the real value of what you do to them. So are you seeing other parts of the organization start to think about using this approach?
Um, well, our situation today is complex, but I think they have the intention to start changing the way of working. I believe we would be able to start working this way in a little more time, but they got the message that this way of working is efficient and brings good things to the company.
Well, yeah, that's good. And as you say, it is only 1 year, and typically these programs take several years because they
Yep.
involve a change in culture, a change in the way in which you work, and a change in understanding how different parts of the organization work. But I would really want to thank you for talking with me today, and it's been really interesting. And honestly, I think what you have achieved is just significant, and I look forward to to hearing more about your journey over the next few years. And I'm pretty sure that there are a number of people who will be watching this interview who would like to know more. So I'm going to hand back to Gerardo now. Gerardo, if you would want to wrap up and provide our listeners and viewers information about how they can find out more.
Well,
Yes.
thanks a lot, David. We really appreciate all this working that and all this theory that's behind all this. That we are, as I've said many times in this interview, we are not used to this kind of process, but it was very interesting and also very how do you say gratificante, Gerardo?
Fulfilling.
Exactly. So thanks a lot for that. And wish us luck.
Great.
That's what we need.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. It is always from my side, I've written a lot about these things. And of course, I've done a lot of work with customers of mine in these areas, but it is always so wonderful to see when someone has success. And I'm just very, very pleased. And just thank you so much for telling us about it.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you both, and saying that I am happy to hear you both speak about this will be a huge understatement. As Joaquin said, I could clearly see that he was not convinced when we started. So so he having him share his experience is very important for me, and I thank him and his team for believing in us and all their support, and David for having spending his time helping me sort of understand this and articulate it better with our customers. So thank you both. Great conversation. I will be sharing contact information for both for our viewers somewhere, I don't know, under the video or on the right, but I will be sharing contact information for all of us. So if anybody wants to reach out to any of us for more information, we're available. And also, I would be interested in our English listeners if they're interested in material, because we will be putting subtitles in this video for our Spanish viewers. So if you're interested in finding out more and would be interested in having English versions of our material, please reach out, because if we have interest, we will be willing to do that. So thank you both very much, and we'll be seeing each other again.